So perhaps we can just begin by taking a moment to bring ourselves present and allowing our eyes to close, if you like, becoming aware of our body sitting here, the points of contact between our body and the chair or the floor, perhaps the touch of clothing or the movement of air, and perhaps beginning to notice breathing happening in the body, noticing the breath moving in and moving out, perhaps noticing how breathing in nourishes the body and breathing out relaxes it, perhaps feeling some appreciation for breathing, perhaps inclining attention warmly towards breathing the way we might incline our attention towards a sleeping infant that we love, aware of the gentle movement in and out of the breath, perhaps noticing how we can be caressed from the inside by the flow of the breath. Bringing attention back into the room, allowing the eyes to open when you're ready. So if you are familiar with mindfulness, then you know that mindfulness has to do a great deal with accepting things as they are. So we often don't spend much time talking about changing things. But today we're going to talk about change, and how mindfulness can support that change, and especially how self-compassion might do that. So I'd like to ask a few questions of the group here now related to change. How many people in this room have some kind of a behavior that you would like to change? Raise your hand if you have a behavior you would like to change. Well, not too many hands. That's impressive. So it might be a behavior like eating too much, or smoking too much, or drinking too much, or maybe you get more angry than you would like, or maybe you would like to be more patient or more helpful. I tend to think all of us have at least one thing we would like to change, although I admire you if you really don't have anything. So I will admit one of the things that I would like to change about myself. I got to come to Korea a year ago to train teachers of mindful self-compassion. And within the first day, I noticed a very interesting thing happening. During the breaks, lots of people came up to me and wanted to have their picture taken with me. At first, I thought it was because I was a visiting teacher from the US. But when everyone wanted their picture taken with me, they were putting their hand on my belly because they said that I looked like the Buddha. And while I would very much like to be like the Buddha, not so much in that particular area. I would like to exercise more and eat less and be more like the Buddha in other ways. So we all have things that we would like to change, things that we're working on. But the real question is, why is it that we don't seem to be able to change some behaviors? Does anybody have any ideas? Why is it so hard to make changes?
변하고 싶어도 못 변하면 저를 되게 책망하는데 그렇게 하면 오히려 변화할 에너지가 없어져서 못 변하는 경우가 많다는 걸 좀 생각하고 있습니다.
You came to the right place. Yes. So self-criticism is often one reason why we don't change, because when we want to change and we don't, we often give ourselves such a hard time that it's easier just not to try. Any other ideas why change is so hard?
이 생뿐만 아니라 전생에 내려오는 어떤 그 습에 의해서 마음은 변화하고 싶은데 고질적인 그 습관이 그 몸에 고착돼 가지고 변하기가 어렵다고 생각합니다.
That modern science has shown us that at least with this life we actually have the ability to change the way our brain works and to overcome habits by instilling new practices. I don't think science has gotten to the point of studying those previous lives just yet. So I would say that from my experience, one way of us overcoming these barriers is directly relevant to what the lady back there said in terms of how we talk to ourselves, how we treat ourselves. She mentioned self-criticism. Is anybody familiar with self-criticism personally? Do you know that experience of having your own self criticize you for the things that you do or you don't do? Maybe you criticize yourself for not raising your hand when I ask the question. That's okay. Have a little self-compassion. So I would invite you to consider something for me. Think about the times when a very good, beloved friend has had a misfortune, has failed or fallen short, or in some other way has had a failure in their life. Think about how you reacted to them. Were you the things that you might say to your friend when that happens, the things that you might do to help them, maybe give them a hug or bring them a cup of tea, and the tone of voice that you might have used with that friend. Just think about that now. Remember maybe the last time this happened, that a friend of yours failed or fell short in some way. How did you respond to them? So now think about a different situation. Think about a time when you failed or fell short or somehow had a misfortune that happened to you. How did you speak to yourself about that? What did you do? And what tone of voice did you use with yourself when you failed or fell short? So I'm wondering if you treated your friend and yourself in the same way. How many people feel that you treated yourself and your friend in about the same way? How many people treated your friend better than you treated yourself? And how many people think that you treated yourself better than you treat your friend? No hands. So Kristen Neff's research shows that you are all fairly normal, at least on this particular dimension. So usually about 84% of people tend to treat other people, their friends, more kindly than they treat themselves. And about 14% treat them about equally, and 2 or 3% treat themselves better than they treat their friends. So you're not alone if you treated your friends more kindly than you treat yourself. So you might have some ideas about why that is. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But first we might talk about how we might change that. Just think about that. 84% of people cause themselves suffering when they fail or fall short or make mistakes. Even though they know how to treat other people, they know how to treat people with kindness and support and comfort, they can't seem to give it to themselves. And most of you in this room know exactly how that feels. So Kristen Neff has done a lot of research about self-compassion. She realized how much suffering in the world is caused by our own relationship with ourselves. And her study of self-compassion began with her study of mindfulness. She went to a mindfulness meditation sitting group while she was in college and was first exposed to this idea of being kind to ourselves. And this was a foreign concept to her, this idea of actually being kind to yourself. She understood about being kind to other people, to practice compassion for others, but the whole idea of practicing compassion for yourself was revolutionary to her. And what she learned by researching self-compassion was that first, that self-compassion is positively related to many positive qualities that we all would like. And it's also negatively related with many less wholesome states like anxiety, depression, dissatisfaction with life. So when she first learned about self-compassion and started talking about it, people dismissed her. So they said, oh, self-compassion, that's just being self-indulgent, or narcissistic and self-centered. Or self-compassion is just too soft. Or people who had achieved a lot in their lives said, oh, if I start being self-compassionate, I'll lose my edge. I won't be as competitive. I won't be able to get to the top as easily. And maybe those are some of the things that you thought about when you heard about self-compassion. I would be surprised if the people in this room didn't think of those things when you heard about self-compassion. So what Kristen ultimately learned was that actually none of those things I just said are actually true. Her research actually showed that people who are more self-compassionate, for example, are actually seen by their partners as more caring and connected and empathic than people who are lower in self-compassion. And on the idea that self-compassion is soft or weak, actually we see that people who are more self-compassionate actually are more resilient. And for example, members of the military who are more self-compassionate tend to be more resilient and able to recover from the experiences of being in war. And people who are very ambitious and want to achieve a great deal are afraid that if they start practicing self-compassion that they won't be able to achieve as much. But actually the research shows that people who are more self-compassionate actually tend to try harder and achieve more because they're not afraid of failing, which is very relevant to what we're talking about here in terms of change. And the reason those people are more apt to keep trying is because if they do fail, which we all fail at times because we're human, they can actually tolerate it because they are not so self-critical. And one more point that's very relevant to what we're talking about here is this idea that self-compassion is just self-indulgence. We actually know that people who are more self-compassionate actually take better care of themselves and are actually better able to make behavior changes than people who are less self-compassionate. People who are more self-compassionate are actually have an easier time quitting smoking or losing weight or exercising more, mainly because they can meet themselves with kindness rather than self-criticism. And we have a teacher of mindful self-compassion in New Zealand who has done a research study with patients with diabetes. And she actually found that if she trained half of the people in the study in mindful self-compassion. And the results of her research showed that the people who were trained in self-compassion actually had lower blood glucose levels and greater quality of life than the people who did not receive self-compassion training. So there's a very real example of how self-compassion training can help people make change in their lives and have it reflected in physiological measures. So I don't think something magical happened when people just meditated and that their blood glucose went down. What happened was these people were able to change their behavior, to exercise more, to eat better, to monitor their glucose more closely. So if those people could change, so can we. And maybe the change will be simply by learning to treat ourselves more kindly if we sometimes fail or fall short of our goals. So for us to practice self-compassion, we should know kind of what it is. And Kristen Neff also, in her study of self-compassion, identified that self-compassion has three parts. So in order for us to be kind to ourselves when we're suffering, we first need to be able to notice when we're actually suffering. So we need to be mindful. So mindfulness is the first component of self-compassion. Has everyone here had the experience of being mindful? Of course you have. Maybe even just fleetingly, every now and then, being fully present to your moment-to-moment experience. But it comes and goes, right? Right. because the mind likes to wander. It likes to think and plan and remember and ruminate, sometimes all at the same time. And I guarantee that nobody in this room has been mindful for the whole time that I've been talking. So that's okay. So mindfulness is the first component. And we can cultivate that capacity through meditation. So the second component of self-compassion would be a realization that we are all human and that we all have wandering minds. We all suffer and we all make mistakes, and we all fail sometimes. How many people in this room have ever suffered in your life?
여기 계신 분 중에서 인생에서 고통을 경험해 본 적이 있는 분?
How many people have in this room have failed in your life? Maybe at raising your hand. Yes, so that's the common humanity, that we are all human. We all make mistakes, we all fall short, we fail sometimes. It's part of what makes us human. But we often forget that we all fail. And when we fail, when we have a problem of some sort, we feel uniquely flawed or isolated or alone because of it. So common humanity is the second part of self-compassion. And the third component of self-compassion is self-kindness, so that when we notice the presence of our own suffering, we can recognize that this is a common human experience, and then we can be kind to ourselves the same way we were able to be kind for our good friends. Mindfulness, common humanity, self-kindness. Just do that and everything will be fine. Not so easy. That's why we have a program called Mindful Self-Compassion. So one tiny way that we can be kind to ourselves is to just simply feel our own kindness. For just a moment, just take one hand and squeeze it very tightly into a fist. Just notice what that feels like right there. It might feel tight or hard or painful. So this is the feeling of self-criticism, when we treat ourselves badly, when we fail or fall short. And then letting go of the fist and opening the palm and placing it over the heart. Just taking a moment to feel the warmth in your hand, to feel the kindness of the touch. Notice what it feels like to just treat yourself with this little bit of kindness. So when we face a difficult situation and we actually notice that we're suffering, we might be able to give us this very gentle gesture of kindness in a moment. So for those of us in the room who have self-critics, we don't have time to go into great depth about this, but it's helpful to just point out a couple things about why we criticize ourselves. People will say, well, I criticize myself because it motivates me to improve. It helps to motivate me to be better and to avoid being criticized by others. Sometimes we criticize ourselves very harshly, mainly so that we lower our standards, so we don't feel disappointed if we do fall short or fail. Sometimes what we do is to criticize ourselves in front of other people, that to actually make them kind of like us, feel sorry for us. And sometimes we criticize ourselves to prevent us from feeling even more difficult emotions like guilt or shame. And if you think about those different reasons why people criticize themselves, you can realize that underneath, this self-critic is actually trying to help us. It's trying to keep us safe from harm. It's just not doing a very good job of that. It's just leaving us feeling criticized and hurt and small. So some of us don't have an inner critic like this. But even those people, and I'm included in that group, still have behaviors they would like to change and can't, and often feel deflated or lost or helpless when they can't change the behavior. So we're now going to do a short version of an exercise from the Mindful Self-Compassion program that helps us explore that inner critic, maybe recognize how it was trying to help us, and instead to find a compassionate way to motivate ourselves to potentially change. So this is an exercise that you can do in written form, or you can just reflect on it. So we begin by just taking some time to think about a behavior that you would like to change. So this would be something that you tend to kind of beat yourself up about when you do it, or when you are unable to change. Don't choose a very distressing thing that you would like to change. Choose something moderate, like a 3 or a 4 on a 1 to 10 scale. So you need to choose a behavior that's changeable and not a characteristic that isn't. So it might be something like, I eat too much, or I don't exercise enough, or I need to meditate more. And once you have something in mind, think about what you say to yourself when you find yourself engaging in that behavior. Is there a self-critical voice that expresses itself? What words does it say, and what tone does it use? Maybe you just have a feeling of judgment or disapproval and no specific words. How does it feel to receive this message from yourself? Maybe even giving yourself compassion for how hard it's been to receive this judgment from this critic. Maybe just saying to yourself, this is hard, this hurts. And now taking a moment to actually turn towards your inner critic, if you have one, and reflect for a moment on why that criticism has gone on for so long. Is there some way in which your inner critic is trying to protect you in some way, to keep you safe from danger or to help you, even if the result has not been very helpful? What motivates your inner critic? And if you can't find any way that your inner critic has been trying to help you, sometimes the self-criticism has no redeeming value, just continuing to give yourself compassion for how much you've suffered in the past. And if you did identify some way that your inner critic was trying to help you, see if you might even give your critic a few words of thanks. Let your inner critic know that even though it may not be serving you very well now, its intention was good and it was doing its best. So, like all of us human beings, inside we have different parts. So we might have a self-critical part, but we also have a part that is caring and compassionate towards us. This part wants us to change, but for very different reasons. This part of yourself loves and accepts you unconditionally. It's wise and clear-sighted and recognizes how this behavior is causing you harm. So just taking a moment perhaps to close your eyes again and place your hand on your heart to reconnect to that kind intention that each of us holds. Feeling the warmth and kindness of your touch, and reflecting again on that behavior that you're struggling with. Your compassionate voice or compassionate self would like you to try to make a change, not because you're unacceptable as you are, but because it wants the best for you. And you might come up with a phrase that captures the essence of your inner compassionate self. It might be something like, I love you and I don't want you to suffer. I care deeply about you and that's why I'd like to help you make a change. Or, I don't want you to keep hurting. I'm here to support you. And now if you'd like, if you have pencil and paper, you might begin to write a short compassionate note to yourself. If you're just imagining this in your mind, beginning to think of what words you might say from that compassionate place to help you, support you, make a change. Take your time.
천천히 한번 해보십시오.
And if you're having trouble finding words, it might be easier to write down the words that would flow from your loving heart when speaking to a dear friend who is struggling with the same thing. So you can always return to these words and maybe you can add to them over time. But for now, just let yourself savor whatever words that came to mind. And if you had trouble finding words, that's okay too. This takes some time. The important thing is that we set our intention to try to be kinder to ourselves, and eventually new habits will form. So I'm wondering if anyone would like to share your experience of this brief exercise in finding our compassionate voice.